Hi, this is Jerry Ball, and you're listening to The Grueling Truth.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of The Grueling Truth, brought to you by Gridiron Mo, an interactive football app where you get to call what you think the offense or defense should do during a live NFL game and see what all other fans have called also. Check out Gridiron Mo at www.gridironmo.com. I'm your host, Mike Goodpaster, and right now I want to welcome in my co-host, Matt Andruscavage.
How's it going tonight, Mike?
Oh, it's great. I'm not a Niner fan, so I know I have something to look forward to this year.
As we always say, dead man walking.
Yeah, you. But we have a special guest.
We know what's going to happen
Matt,
to you.
I'm trying to introduce a special guest, and you're interrupting.
Then don't pick fights.
That's very rude. I didn't pick a fight. I just made a statement of fact. But our special guest tonight is going to be one of the co-hosts on the CFL Weekly Show. Help welcome to The Grueling Truth, Brian Schmidt.
Good to be here, guys. I've been here 3 minutes, and already I'm nervous. So, into you too.
Matt makes people nervous. I mean, he picks on everybody, so you've got to watch out for him.
Yeah, I knew I should have. All right. Anyway, go ahead.
All right. Well, our topic tonight is something we've talked about with a lot of former players. We've had guys like Robert Brazil, Eddie Metter, bunch of guys on that we think deserve enshrinement in the Hall of Fame. We also said, as you know, we've written articles about guys we don't think should be in the Hall of Fame. So we're going to have that discussion tonight. So We're going to start off basically with the selection process. And from what I get from the selection process, it's one sports writer from every city that has an NFL team. New York has two because they have two teams. Somehow Cleveland still gets one, even though they haven't had a team in years. But
right.
I mean, do you think that's a fair way to select a player with basically sports writers making the selections? And it's like the Supreme Court. Unless you die, as long as you go to the meetings, you still get the vote every year. So what's your take on the selection process, Matt?
Well, we've talked about this before. I don't have a problem with sports writers having a part in it, but anybody can just get up and write anything they want. You obviously you want well-trained people, you want good journalists that are writing these pieces, but the truth is anybody can write anything, and all it takes is a player to say the wrong thing at the wrong time to a journalist, and they're basically scarred for life. They can get blacklisted, and that has happened many times. So I don't think it should be just one unilateral body that does this, because they can all just kind of lobby for each other and just blacklist somebody. I think it should be much different than what it is. It should be some kind of separation of powers and checks and balances on this.
All right, Brian, what's your take on it?
I would agree with that, and I think one of the biggest problems is writers that do the selections, the criteria should be what you've done in your career. I also believe that with that, there's, what have you done on the biggest stage? In other words, what you've done in the playoffs, what you've done in the Super Bowl. I think, however, their selection process, they will pick guys because of what they've done in the Super Bowl or the playoffs, and they've hardly done anything in their career. And I think that's the problem. I think that's where, Joe Namath is a great example of that. He had one big opportunity in the Super Bowl. That's what he's known for. But really, honestly, what did he do in his career to deserve to be in the Hall of Fame?
Well, let's look at Joe Namath. This is what Joe Namath did. He had 173 touchdown passes, 220 interceptions, a 50.1 career completion percentage, a quarterback rating of 65. He led the Jets to the biggest victory in Super Bowl history, but that was a game that was won 16-7 that Matt Schnell probably should have been the MVP, and if he wasn't, Randy Beverly with 3 interceptions probably should have. On top of that, his career record as an NFL quarterback was 68, 71, and 4. And, I mean, the Super Bowl, he was 17 for 28, 206 yards, no touchdowns. And like I said, if you look at the game closer, I still think Matt Schnell should have been the MVP. What do you think, Matt?
Oh, definitely. Joe Namath is probably the best example of a player who gets in primarily, just for one game that he was the only Super Bowl MVP that never threw a touchdown. He didn't even play all that good, in the one game that he's known for. I'll give him the fact that I think he psyched out the Colts. But, I mean, there's just no body of work. Even look at his numbers in '68, they weren't all that good. You watch Super Bowl III, and I think Weeb Eubank outcoached Don Shula. I think their defense was underrated, and no question that Matt Snell should have been the MVP.
All right, so we talk about a quarterback that shouldn't be in. Brian, you want to name a few that you think maybe should?
Well, being a Steelers guy, obviously one that I know has been talked about before is L.C. Greenwood.
No, quarterback-wise.
Quarterback-wise.
Yeah, we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about Namath. Just go over who we think maybe should be there.
I don't know. I don't know if I can think of one off the top of my head right now that should be there. I know it shouldn't be.
Because you're a Steelers fan. What about Kenny Anderson?
Yeah, I would agree with Kenny Anderson. I hadn't thought about him in a while, but I would agree.
You're talking about a guy that was a 1981 NFL MVP, 4-time Pro Bowler, led the NFL in passing back-to-back. First guy to ever do it back-to-back. He's got a career passer rating of 81, where Joe Namath's sitting at 65, 197 touchdowns to 160 interceptions. Actually, if you look at it,
would agree.
Yeah, the Bengals 73, 75. I mean, really, from 73 through 77 were one of the best teams in the NFL. They just weren't quite as good as the Dolphins, Raiders, and Steelers. And then he takes them to the Super Bowl in 81. What's your opinion on Anderson, Matt?
Oh, no question. We've talked about this many times. Kenny Anderson, one of the most unheralded, underrated quarterbacks in the history of the NFL. He's everything that you want in a quarterback. Unfortunately for him, he probably gets penalized because he didn't win the Super Bowl. But there's other quarterbacks that are in the Hall of Fame that didn't win a Super Bowl, like Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, Dan Fouts. I think he's better than Dan Fouts. I think Dan Fouts is a perfect example of a guy who I think he's very good. I think he's deserving of a Super Bowl or a Hall of Fame enshrinement. I think Warren Moon is deserving of Hall of Fame enshrinement. But I think Kenny Anderson probably is a little bit better. He's the MVP of 81. I don't remember if he won another MVP, but those passing titles in the 70s when he was doing things that, he was almost one of the first modern-day high-percentage completion quarterbacks.
Yeah, and, what about a guy like Roman Gabriel?
No question. Roman Gabriel's 1969 MVP. That Rams team was really good, but, again, probably penalized because the Rams didn't have a lot of success in the playoffs. Now, maybe, that 67 team was real good, but because of the rules the way they were, even though they beat Green Bay in the regular season, they had to travel to Green Bay in the playoffs because of the way the rules were. And I think if that game's in L.A., I think the Rams win that game.
And the same thing happened to them in 69. I think they had a better record than the Vikings and had to go to Minnesota. But the thing that stands out to me is the rules were different back then. Ball was thrown deep a lot more. You looked at Namath throwing, 50 or 60 more interceptions and touchdowns. Gabriel was 201 touchdowns, 149 interceptions, which for back then is pretty dang good.
Right. You just didn't see that a lot. And those kind of numbers back in those days just didn't happen very often.
And, Brian, what's your opinion on Jim Kelly?
I'll be honest, I was never a big Jim Kelly guy. Was a good quarterback. Certainly, stats, especially in the red gun period, but I just was never the biggest Jim Kelly guy. I was more excited about him back in his USFL days, back when you were in run and shoot. Great stats, great quarterback, but, again, on the biggest stage, I'm very kind of on him. He was a good quarterback, but, he's certainly not in my top 10 and his top 10 quarterbacks ever played in the NFL.
Yeah, and that leaves me, you talked about that, and I think this. I'll give him a pass on the last 3 Super Bowls. I think those teams were just better than his. But the first one against the Giants, which leads me to another guy that I don't think should be in the Hall of Fame, Marv Levy. I mean,
no
they
question.
got completely out-coached in that game.
Yeah. Yeah, there are coaches that should be in the Hall of Fame before he should be.
Yeah, Tom Flores being won 2 Super Bowls.
Yep,
anytime you win 2 Super Bowls, you belong in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and you look what he did. He also won one as a player. He was a backup quarterback to Lynn Dawson for the Kansas City Chiefs in Super Bowl IV. I think he was still, if not the leading passer in AFL history, he was top 5. He played every year in the AFL. And I think he gets ignored big time. And another guy that I think gets ignored is Bum Phillips. And I know he didn't win a Super Bowl, didn't even get to one, but Bum Phillips basically revolutionized the 3-4 defense.
Absolutely.
And gets ignored, just like, Wade didn't get the credit he was deserved really until this year with it. But any other coaches you can think of, Matt?
Coaches that should be in the Hall of Fame. Well, anytime you win 2, I think you belong in there, so I would put George Seifert in that mix. He'd be a little bit lower on the list, but I think he was a very good coach. And again, like Tom Flores, you win 2 Super Bowls in the modern era, you belong in the Hall of Fame. I think Tom Coughlin's going to belong in the Hall of Fame, and he was a real good coach. But I agree with Bum Phillips. I agree with Tom Flores for sure. I'm all right putting Marv Levy in if you're going to put Bum Phillips in. I think they were both really good coaches. But I think there's guys that belong in before Levy just because, like you said, they played better teams those last 3, but that first one, he just got flat-out coached. I don't pin the whole thing on Jim Kelly because, Norwood makes the kick. Everybody feels differently. But I just think there's other guys deserving before you put a guy like Marv Levy in.
What about your opinion of George Seifert being in the Hall of Fame, Brian?
I would agree. Again, if you're going to compare Marv Levy to these coaches we're mentioning.
Well, I'm not even just Marv Levy. Do you think George Seifert, what he did, stands on its own to be in the Hall of Fame?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it does. And, again, the name that Dan Reeves is another name to me. He should be in the Hall of Fame. For what he did, going to Super Bowls, taking 2 different teams to Super Bowls with essentially not the greatest of talented teams. That Atlanta team was not that Atlanta team was not the most talented team you're ever going to see, and yet got them to a Super Bowl. So, he's another name that to me should be in the Hall of Fame based on, again, if even from a comparison standpoint, but just on his own merit, he should be in the Hall of Fame.
And I could defend George Seifert on that too, because you look at his record. He's got one of the highest win percentages in the history of the NFL. He was one of the best defensive coordinators in the game. You look at the defenses that helped the Niners win Super Bowls in the 80s. George Seifert was behind the defense. He's got a good record. He won 2 Super Bowls with 2 different quarterbacks. I think that's pretty good accomplishments.
I don't know why you had to defend him so much. I agree. So, see, Matt's a 49er fan, so he thought he had to throw in some extra stuff because he thought.
No, I wasn't sure where you were at with it.
I don't think he's one of the greatest coaches of all time, but I think when you compare him to Marv Levy, he should be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
I mean, hands down. And another guy that Brian talked about, I'll let Brian talk a little bit more about him now, L.C. Greenwood.
Yeah, to me, a guy that was, in the Pro Bowl, I believe 6 times, was a part of 4, Super Bowl championships, and, if I remember correctly, he was on the All-Decade team in the 70s, and, a great career. And again, this is something I think sometimes with Pittsburgh in general, I think in that time period, there's so many guys that are in the Hall of Fame or household names that, we tend to forget the guys that were just the mainstays and were the meat and potatoes of that defense, and L.C. Greenwood was that guy. Everybody can talk about Ham, Lambert, and all that, and Mean Joe Green, all that, but L.C. Greenwood was just as good as those guys.
Yeah, and the thing